All right, learners, welcome back for Season 4 of the Deep Dive. We're ready to jump into GCSE Business Studies.
Yeah, we're going to make sure you really get it this time.
This season, we're focusing on making these concepts easy and fun so you can dominate those exams.
We'll break down those tough textbooks and make business come alive.
So for our first deep dive this season, we're tackling organizational structures, basically the DNA of any successful business, how everything fits together to make the magic happen.
Exactly. Think of it like a blueprint for success. It defines who does what, who's in charge, and how everyone works together.
You can probably imagine how chaotic a business would be without a clear structure, like a football team with no coach or position.
Total mayhem. Right.
Now, to really get this, let's imagine we're looking at Technova, this awesome fictional tech company. They're creating all the cool gadgets you can think of.
Love that.
Yeah.
So let's say Technova is just starting out. They probably have a pretty simple structure called a hierarchy.
Hierarchy, like a pyramid, right?
Exactly. With the big boss, the managing director, at the very top making the big decisions.
Okay, so the managing director is the ultimate decision maker. Who comes next in line?
Well, below the MD, you've got the directors. Each one's in charge of a different department, like marketing, finance, or production.
Okay, got it, like the generals leading their troops.
Exactly. Then you have managers overseeing smaller teams and supervisors who keep a close eye on the day-to-day stuff. And at the bottom of the pyramid are the operators, the people actually making those gadgets a reality.
It's like a chain of command. Everyone knows their place and who they answer to. Makes sense, but what happens when Technova starts to grow? Does this pyramid always work?
That's a great question, because as a company expands, that tall hierarchy can start to feel a bit clunky.
Clunky.
Yeah, if a message has to go through like a million layers from the MD all the way down to the factory floor, things can get real slow.
Right, and in the tech world, speed is key.
Absolutely. It's like playing telephone with way too many people. The message can get totally messed up along the way.
So how does a company like Technova avoid these communication nightmares as they grow?
One option is to flatten the hierarchy. So it's less like a pyramid and more like a pancake.
Okay, so less layers, faster communication.
Exactly. Imagine removing a couple layers of management. So now managers report directly to directors. Supervisors oversee bigger teams.
Okay, so it's streamlined.
Yeah.
Sounds good on paper, but are there any downsides to this flatter structure?
Well, of course. While communication's faster, those supervisors now have a way bigger workload. They're overseeing more people, more projects, and they might struggle to give the same level of support.
Got it. So it's a trade-off. Faster communication, but less control.
Right.
So as Technova grows, they have to think carefully about which structure works best for them. Now, I've heard of another way companies try to streamline things, something called delayering. What's that all about?
So delayering, it's like taking a knife to that hierarchy pyramid and slicing off a whole layer of management.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's a bold move usually to cut costs and become more efficient.
Okay, but doesn't that mean people lose their jobs?
Sometimes, yeah, but it can also mean shifting roles and responsibility.
So if Technova decided to delayer, what would that look like in real life?
Well, imagine the director of marketing suddenly taking on the responsibilities of all the marketing managers below them.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Right, and the remaining managers and supervisors would also have to absorb extra work.
It's like a high-stakes game of Tetris fitting everyone into a smaller space. So what are the good and bad things about delayering?
Well, the biggest upside is cost savings. By cutting out a whole layer of salaries, Technova can free up money to invest elsewhere. And theoretically, fewer layers should make communication faster and decisions happen quicker.
That sounds amazing, but I bet there's a downside.
Of course. The biggest risk is overloading those remaining employees. Those managers and supervisors are already stretched thin, and now they have to handle even more, so it could lead to burnout, lower morale, and mistakes happening.
Delayering is a gamble then.
It can be, yeah.
Big potential rewards, but also some big risks.
Definitely.
So Technova would need to carefully weigh the pros and cons.
Absolutely.
Seems like there's no easy answer.
That's the thing about organizational structures. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. The key is to find what allows the company to be flexible, efficient, and responsive to its people and its customers.
This has been really insightful. So if you were an employee at Technova, which structure would you prefer to work in and why?
That's a great question. It really shows how organizational structures aren't just about charts and lines. It's about people, and different people thrive in different environments.
Great point. We'll dig deeper into these human elements and even more complex structures in the next part. But for now, let's give our listeners a moment to process all this info. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we've been looking at Technova and hierarchies. But there's another piece of the puzzle we need to talk about: departmentalization.
Departmentalization.
Yeah, it's basically like organizing your sock drawer, putting things into neat categories.
Okay, so how does that work in a company?
Well, it's all about grouping people with similar skills or functions together into different departments.
So at Technova, you might have a marketing department, a finance department, a production department, each with their own specialists.
Exactly.
Each one focuses on their own area of the business, like a well-organized toolbox.
Perfect analogy. But how do companies decide how to divide these departments? Is it just based on traditional functions like marketing and finance?
Well, functional departmentalization is common, but there are other ways to do it. Technova could create departments based on their product lines, like a smartphone department, a wearable tech department.
Oh, I see. So they could even organize departments based on specific customer groups, like consumer tech and business tech.
Exactly. Or even by geographical location, like North American sales and European operations. It all depends on Technova's specific needs and what their goals are.
So departmentalization is about creating these focused units within the company. But how does this all fit into the hierarchy we talked about earlier?
Great question. They actually work together. Think of departments as branches on that hierarchy tree. Okay, so a marketing manager in the marketing department still reports to the director of marketing, who then reports to the MD.
Exactly. Departments provide the structure for organizing work within that hierarchy. But just like hierarchies, there are different ways to approach departmentalization.
And I'm sure each approach has its pros and cons.
You got it.
What are some challenges companies might face when they're deciding how to set up their departments?
Well, one common issue is finding the right balance between specialization and collaboration. Departments are great for developing deep expertise, but sometimes they can create silos where communication breaks down between teams.
So it's like each department becomes its own little island, focused on their own thing and forgetting about the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
How do you prevent that?
Well, Technova would need to create opportunities for cross-departmental collaboration, like regular meetings, shared projects, or even a more flexible structure where people can move between departments as needed.
Got it. So breaking down those walls and building bridges instead. So collaboration is key. Are there any other potential downsides to departmentalization?
Another challenge is adapting to change. Let's say Technova launches a totally new product that doesn't fit neatly into their current departments.
Like what? Give me an example.
Like a device that combines fitness tracking, virtual reality gaming, and social media all in one.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Right. Where would that fit in their current structure? They might have to completely rethink everything, create a whole new department, or even restructure their existing ones.
That sounds disruptive.
It can be, yeah.
But sometimes you got to shake things up to keep up with innovation. Right?
Exactly.
So departmentalization isn't a one-time decision. It needs to be flexible and adapt as the company grows and the market changes.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, those silos. Can you explain a bit more about why those are bad for a company?
Sure thing. When departments become too isolated, communication suffers. Important information doesn't get shared, which leads to duplicated effort, conflicting priorities, even missed opportunities.
It's like everyone's working on a puzzle, but no one has all the pieces.
Exactly. Silos can also stifle creativity and innovation. If teams aren't talking to each other and sharing ideas, they might miss out on breakthroughs.
So it's all about breaking down those silos and encouraging communication and a shared sense of purpose.
Absolutely.
This has been really eye-opening. But I want to shift gears a bit and talk about another key element: centralization versus decentralization.
Ah, yes, the classic debate of where the power lies within a company.
Before we get into the details, can you give us a quick rundown of what each approach means?
Sure. Think of centralization as a tightly controlled spaceship. All decisions, big and small, are made by the captain at the top, the managing director in Technova's case.
Okay, so it's all about control from the top down. What about decentralization? Is it like a fleet of smaller independent ships?
Great analogy. In a decentralized structure, decision-making power is spread out among different levels and departments, so those department heads and team leaders have more autonomy.
Makes sense. It's less about rigid hierarchy and more about empowering people closer to the action.
Exactly. But as with everything in business, there are trade-offs.
Right, there's always a catch.
Let's look at the pros and cons of each using Technova as our example.
Sounds good to me. Let's start with centralization. What are the advantages of having all that decision-making power at the top?
Well, in the early days of a company like Technova, a centralized approach can be really helpful. It provides a clear vision and direction when things are still getting established. The MD, with all their experience, can steer the ship and make sure everyone's rowing in the same direction.
Like a captain navigating through those rough startup waters. But what happens as Technova grows? Could centralization become a problem?
Absolutely. As the company gets bigger, that centralized decision-making can start to feel like a bottleneck. Every decision, even small ones, have to go through the MD, and that can slow things down significantly.
And in the fast-paced tech world, being slow to react can be deadly.
Exactly. Plus, it can stifle creativity and innovation.
Yeah.
If people lower down the hierarchy feel like they have no voice, they're less likely to contribute their ideas.
So all those talented engineers and designers at Technova could have brilliant ideas,
Yeah.
but they're bottled up because they don't feel empowered to share them or make decisions.
Exactly. And that's where decentralization can be a game changer. By giving more decision-making power to lower levels, you tap into all that knowledge and creativity throughout the company.
Okay, so decentralization sounds like it has the potential to unleash a lot of innovation. But are there any downsides to giving up that centralized control?
Of course, one potential challenge is keeping everyone on the same page. If every department is making its own decisions, it can be tough to make sure they're all working towards the same goals.
So instead of a unified fleet of ships all heading in the same direction, you might have some going rogue and crashing into each other.
Yeah, that's a good way to visualize it.
So how do you prevent that from happening?
Technova would need to have really clear communication channels and decision-making frameworks. Everyone needs to understand the big picture goals and how their individual decisions fit into that.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, balancing the freedom and flexibility of decentralization with the need for coordination and alignment.
Exactly.
Are there any real-world examples of companies that have successfully used a decentralized structure?
Oh, tons. A lot of big tech companies known for being innovative have embraced decentralization to some extent. Companies like Google, for example, they give their teams a lot of freedom to make decisions and experiment.
That makes sense. In such a fast-moving industry, you have to be able to adapt quickly to stay ahead of the game.
Right.
But I imagine it takes a special kind of company culture and leadership to make decentralization work.
Absolutely. You need a lot of trust, transparency, and a willingness to empower your employees.
This has been a really insightful discussion. It's made me think about organizational structures in a whole new way.
Glad to hear it.
But before we move on to the final part, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. What do you think are the key factors a company should consider when deciding how much power to give to different levels?
That's a great question. And it's one we'll be exploring further in our next segment. We'll also delve into some of the more complex and emerging organizational structures that are shaping the future of work.
Sounds fascinating. I can't wait to unpack those ideas in our final part. Stay tuned. All right, learners, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been exploring the ins and outs of organizational structures, from those classic hierarchies to departmentalization and that power struggle between centralization and decentralization. But now it's time to step into the future. Let's look at some of the more innovative and dynamic structures that are popping up in the business world.
Yeah, things are changing rapidly. And the way companies organize themselves is changing too. Think about the impact of technology globalization and the changing expectations of workers. All of these things are forcing companies to ditch those old-school pyramid structures.
You're right. Those rigid hierarchies might have worked in the past, but they're starting to feel a bit outdated.
Exactly, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
So what are some of these exciting new structures that are shaking things up?
Well, one that's becoming really popular, especially in tech, is the matrix structure.
Matrix structure. That sounds intriguing.
Imagine a grid where employees report to 2 managers instead of just 1.
2 managers. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. How does that even work?
It's all about flexibility. You might have a functional manager, like the head of marketing, and a project manager who's leading a specific initiative. So an employee working on that project would report to both managers.
So they have 2 bosses, basically.
Kinda, but it's more about having different points of contact for different aspects of their work.
Okay, so it's about creating a more fluid structure that can adapt to different projects and priorities.
Exactly.
But doesn't that create a lot of confusion about who's in charge?
It can, which is why communication and collaboration are super important in a matrix structure. But the benefits can be huge. You're bringing together people from different departments with different skills and perspectives. That can lead to some serious innovation and problem solving.
It's like assembling a dream team for each project, pulling in the best people from across the company.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be really effective. But I imagine it takes a special kind of company culture to make it work.
You're right. You need a culture that values teamwork, open communication, and willingness to share power and decision-making. Not every company is ready for that kind of change.
It's definitely a bold move.
Mm-hmm.
But for those who can pull it off, it seems like the matrix structure could be a game changer.
Absolutely.
This is fascinating stuff. It seems like the future of organizational structures is all about being flexible, adaptable, and breaking down those silos.
Right. It's about finding what works best for the company and its people.
Are there any other innovative structures out there that are really pushing the boundaries?
Definitely. One that's getting a lot of attention lately, especially among startups and tech companies, is holacracy.
Holacracy. That sounds intense.
It's pretty radical. Imagine a company with no traditional hierarchy or management layers at all.
No hierarchy, no managers. How does anything get done?
It's not chaos. It's actually very structured. Holacracy is built around the idea of self-management. Authority and decision-making are distributed throughout the organization in a very specific way. Think of it like a network of interconnected circles, each with a clear purpose and roles.
So instead of having a boss, you have a set of guidelines and processes that guide your work.
Exactly. And each circle has the freedom to make decisions and adapt without having to go through layers of approval.
Wow, that's a lot of freedom.
It is. And it allows for incredible speed and responsiveness.
But I bet it takes a very specific type of person to thrive in that kind of environment.
You're absolutely right. Holacracy requires a high level of trust transparency and a willingness to constantly learn and adapt. It's not for everyone.
It sounds both exciting and a little bit terrifying.
Uh-huh. It can be both.
But for the right company, it could be revolutionary.
Absolutely.
This has been an incredible journey through the world of organizational structures, from the familiar to the totally unexpected. It's clear that the way companies organize themselves is constantly evolving.
And that's why it's such an exciting field to study.
Exactly.
For those of you preparing for your GCSE Business Studies exams, this is essential knowledge. But even if you're not a student, understanding how organizations work is valuable no matter what career path you choose.
Well said. A huge thank you to Google Notebook LM for their help in putting together this deep dive. This episode was a PLC strategy production. Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more insightful explorations into the world of GCSE Business Studies.
Until next time, keep learning and keep diving deep.